areas of law, especially in postgraduate college. It was the most sought after discipline at one point of time. Whereas today, when you look at the way in which state governments are thinking of repealing labor law, and you are suddenly confronted with, okay, so what is the role for labor law? How is it possible that you are thinking of suspending laws, repealing all laws, in order to be able to talk about what is known as the ease of business? So labor today is at a very challenging place. And so, as all of us know, that when something is in a very challenging place, there are two ways in which we can talk about it. We can talk about it to say that, okay, this is a, so you look at the history. And so, in fact, once when I was speaking to Professor Upendra Bakshi about labor law, he said, oh, but you're talking about labor history. Because it seems as if the big battles, the major battles around labor have been fought and they are over. And so we are only looking at maybe past struggles, past glory, as we're all very happy to do, look at our glorious past and say that, this is how it used to be. That's one option. The other option is to say, okay, in one sense, when you're down, the only way you can go is go up. And so I would want to think about labor law as it is today, as a field of opportunity to go back to what we understand as what are the fundamentals of this discipline, what are the basics of this discipline, and in the same way also look at how this can be transformed. What are the new areas, what are the new connections, what are the new disciplines into which labor law is going today. And perhaps that is how we can think of restructuring, reimagining labor law. And so I would like to start my presentation by, I have a PPT here which I can share with all of you. And so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them later. So let us start the presentation. So one thing that I thought was important to start off understanding labor law is to say that you can start off teaching labor law by talking about the various statutes that are there, talking about important case law. The other way that we can talk about labor law and how do we teach labor law so that students today are able to understand its complexity, understand the various dimensions of this particular discipline, and find a way of making it more effective. So when we are talking about it, the first question that arises when you say, okay, teaching it critically, what does teaching it critically mean? And so I will start with saying, okay, what do we mean by saying teaching labor law critically? How do we teach statute critically? What do we mean by teaching statute critically? And towards the end, I have another presentation, which is about the contemporary challenges to labor law. Now, I have also presented these in the online refresher course that we have done last year. I hope some of you have enrolled in that refresher course. And I would be kind of teaching from there, looking at what is it that we were trying to cover in those videos. We'll also look at the new labor codes, the labor reforms, and perhaps look at labor law in new places. So to begin, the first question, like I said, if you look at a labor law and you listen to what experts have been saying, then they're saying that labor has had a long history. In fact, last year, the ILO celebrated 100 years of its existence. So this helps us pause for a minute and say, okay, this is an area of law that was perhaps terribly important at a particular point of time, but does it continue to be so important today? Having moved, it has labor law. So when we say labor law, it came into existence even before the international human rights instruments that we know of. Has labor law now, in that sense, transformed itself into human rights law? And from human rights law, has it gone into the various segments? So when we talk about disability or we talk about gender, or we talk about various other forms of oppression, have those areas taken on what is labor law's core? When we talk about unpaid work, when we talk about the gender gap, are we talking about labor law now reinventing itself when we talk about the right to dignity, for example, or we talk about forced labor, we talk about the right against exploitation in the Indian Constitution? Have the elements or the central features, the core features of labor law now moved into other areas? Uh, as we are looking at this, we are also conscious that in this history, what is it that labor law has achieved? So one of the first ways in which you start looking at labor law and you deal with the materials that you have, you find that labor law was largely intended in terms of the capitalist mode of the economy, which concentrated power and wealth and resources in the hands of few. And you had this huge difference between those who owned capital and those who owned labor. And the first initial ideas of labor law came in to redistribute this powers and redistribute economic and social power. So labor law begins to be talking about the question of social power. When you have these fundamentals of labor law, isn't it, that you have collective bargaining, you have a trade union, you have a group of workers, and even the very idea of labor is not about the individual. So there is a huge, important significance to using the term labor as against using the term employment. Labor comes to signify a group, a class, and whereas employment largely looks at the individual contract of employment. Employment law is largely governed by what we also know as contract law. That is where two persons enter into a contract and they have a certain way in which they want the terms of contracts to operate. Whereas with labor law, you are seeing that it is not about the individual contract of employment, but it is about how groups are or groups require the protection of the law in order to ensure that there is a more fair distribution of benefits. If you look at the Indian Constitution, for example, and how does the Indian Constitution deal with questions of labor, then you know that it is not only the fundamental rights, because you do have you have a right against forced labor, you have a right against exploitation, you have a right against discrimination. In fact, 16(4), when it talks about equal opportunities, is talking about public employment. And along with fundamental rights, you have the whole directive principles of state policy and very many provisions in the directive principle which talk about questions of social justice, equality, dignity. But what we also see in terms of labor law are sections of people who are excluded from the law or who do not figure in the law. And one particular area which is becoming more and more important, and in the pandemic, it really forced all of us to think about it, and that was domestic work. So when you are faced with certain forms of work, which traditionally you did not imagine as work, but is now emerging as a big and a major area of work, and you find that this is an area of work that's completely excluded from the law. Similarly, you have many employments in what is termed as the unorganized or the informal sector, where the law is more obvious in its absence. There is no law at all. When you deal with factories, for example, where you have less than 10 workers, when you deal with migrant labor, and the pandemic really, in that sense, brought home to us that these are workers with no protections. I mean, there was no employer who could hold them back. There were no benefits that they could access. They could not, even though the government promised them salaries, they were not given their salaries, and the petition was dragged on in the Supreme Court. So you saw that you have sections of the workforce which are largely migrant, and you had people walking back home, and that brought to us the entire idea of the fact that you have workers who are not being protected by the law. And this brings us to the reasons that there is one way in which all of this is being understood, as saying that this is the impact of globalization and deregulation. So this is something that we will look at in the second part of the presentation, where we are looking at globalization and deregulation, globalization, liberalization, and privatization as an important area where the law seems to be changing. So, even from the short introduction, I think it would be quite evident to you that when we mean that we need to teach labor law critically, you need to look not only at statute, not only at case law, but you need various other insights to teach labor law. That is, why did labor law get to be formulated the way it is? Why do we talk about industries? Why don't we talk about all employment places? For example, why don't we talk about the house as a place of work? Even in child labor, for example, you have the exemptions to family labor. So what is this distinction that you make between the workplace and the family, the workplace and the home? How did these distinctions come about? Because if you look at how the feudal system worked, in the feudal system, there was no difference between the family and the public, because you had people who worked almost in conditions of slavery, both within the house and outside the house. So it's not like people didn't work in houses as well as outside the house. It's just that you did not formulate this in terms of labor and employment. The entire logic of labor law emerges only with industrialization. And it is a post-industrial world that we begin to look at labor very differently from how it used to be looked at early. In this context, it becomes very obvious that we have to look at a historical evolution. You have to look at what are the various stages through which labor moved, so that it moved from one position to the other. It moved from a question of bondedness, it moved from a question of slavery to a question of a free contract. And here you also are looking at this transformation of the working class in terms of what their aspirations are, in terms of what kind of regulations are we talking about. We're talking about how contemporary reality must inform our understanding of labor law. We cannot operate only in a very rarefied space, which is the courtroom, which is how normally, at least that's the way I studied law, that you read law only in terms of what the court has done or held in a particular case. Very rarely did you engage with materials or empirical material, for example, case studies or field work, wherein you spoke to people and you saw how the law actually operates in reality, very far away from how statute and case law looks at it. Another way in which one engages with labor law critically is not to get tied up with the various legislations. Now, labor in India, also perhaps because of the reason that it is found both in the central and the state list, is an area which is over legislated. So you don't have one law, and all of you know that there is an effort that is being made to put all the 40 central legislations on labor into 4 different codes. And this project is on for several years now. And what we have so far is only one code. So we only have the wage code, which has been notified by the central government, and the other 3 codes are still in various stages of work. So this the effort to codify law is also telling us that there is a need to understand questions of labor protection across different legislations. So who is a worker in the law, or what qualifies as work, and what protections do people have under the law, is something that you can try and understand so that you can look at it differently. Instead of only saying, okay, under the Industrial Disputes Act, this is the definition of a worker, without mentioning the fact that the Minimum Wage Act has a different definition, the ESI has a different definition, and the Contract Labor Act has a different definition. So if you're able to at least say, okay, let us look at the definition of the worker across legislations, and let us look at what is qualifying as work. across legislations, then you have a very different understanding of labor law, which is a very interconnected and holistic understanding, as against looking at legislations and being caught up with the imagination of a particular legislation. What the other way in which we talk about teaching labor law critically is perhaps asking questions as, what is the purpose of labor law? Is the purpose of labor law, because our training as lawyers in the other branches of law brings us to this position where we say, okay, but law must always be objective and neutral. Courts are meant to be fair to everyone. You have this entire idea of the blindfolded image of justice, which means that you are not going to look at the person before you. But if you look at labor law and you look at various judgments of the Supreme Court, you do come across this fact that at least there is one set of judgments which says that no conditions of work, questions of labor must always be understood differently, and you do not place the employee and the employer, you do not place labor and capital on the same footing. Even, for example, even in traditional contract law, you know that a contract of employment is an exception to the general laws of contract. So a contract of employment is deemed to be a contract in which the consent is not free. And so everything that the employee agrees to is not necessarily by consent. So the presumption that a court of law can make is that a person who is entering into employment enters into employment at a slightly lower footing than the person who offers the employment, and hence this inequality is something that the legislation, that courts are supposed to look at. So when one says what is the purpose of labor law, then the purpose, you can see, is to talk about unequal positions of power, and the law coming in that sense to try and create a level playing field, because the level playing field does not exist. Similarly, the purpose of labor law is to say, for example, if you take the Minimum Wages Act and the definition of a minimum wage, why should the state notify a wage? Why is it not left to parties? After all, if you look at the free market, then in the free market, everybody is equally competent to buy and sell goods. I mean, I can sell my labor to the highest bidder. Why does the state need to come in? And in fact, in the United States, the minimum wage legislations during the New Deal period was struck down as violative of the right to work, which means that if I am willing to work for 1 rupee, nobody should be able to say that I cannot work for that money. Right? So when we say, okay, here, what is the purpose of labor law? Why do we have a minimum wage? And if you look at the Supreme Court's judgment in Sanjit Roy, as well as the PUDR case, the Supreme Court has held that non-payment of minimum wages amounts to forced labor, right? And here we begin to see that the purpose of labor law is not simply to make some conditions for regulating employment, but the purpose of labor law is to ensure that there is a level playing field, that workers are not exploited, and this is in furtherance of the directive principles of state policy, that child labor, the children's tender age must not be exploited, that workers must be entitled to some dignity and some support when they are no longer able to work, right? So the purpose of labor law, if you want to look at it from the constitutional point of view, you want to look at it from welfare point of view, you want to look at it from protective legislation, there are other purposes of labor law, and it's not simply trying to make some regulation in the workplace. Similarly, if you talk about how can one teach labor law to be more effective, you have the traditional case law method and you have what is known as a Socratic method, both of which have their advantages. So a case law method allows you to contextualize certain principles, right? So if you look at one of the most famous cases in labor law, which is and in fact last week when you were hearing that the BEST, the Bombay buses, are going to be retired, You and people were saying that it is a landmark movement because these buses have been around for any number of years, and a seminal case that we all were doing, Workmen's Compensation Act, was the BEST versus Mrs. Agnes, right? So when you do case law and you make it real in that sense, and if you remember, this was a case of a conductor who was standing on the footboard, right? So if you operated on strictly taught principles, you could say, but of course, why was he standing on the footboard? And anybody traveling on the footboard, if they are injured, would be a contributor to that negligence, and hence it would not be the negligence of the employer. Similarly, whether a worker who was who had got off his shift can still be understood to be a workman or not, right? So you have this case, and so case law that way bring to life certain principles about what is the contract of employment. Can we assume that the contract of employment ends the minute there is a bell, that is immediately at 5 o'clock, work is over and the worker is deemed to no longer be in employment? And BEST is a beautiful case wherein the court holds that, Bombay is a city of distances, and so a worker does not get off immediately after the time period is over, but the worker is continued to be on premises, and since the entire BEST fleet was considered to be the premises of the employer. Okay, so a case law method, in a sense, brings to life certain principles. And so what do we mean by being in employment? What does the contract of employment extend? What is the meaning of in the course and out of employment? All of these become very real when you can use a case to demonstrate this. But you can also use what is known as the Socratic method, which is to ask a question. Like I said in the previous point, if you see, what is the purpose of labor law? So when one is teaching Workmen's Compensation Act or Employees Compensation Act today, what is the objective of the Compensation Act? And if you look closely, you will find that the role that the courts assume when they are dealing with a compensation case and the role that the courts assume when they're dealing with, let us say, a disciplinary case is very different. Because in cases of compensation, you are faced with this hard reality of somebody either being permanently injured or somebody who has lost a life. And you want the law to be as accommodating as possible. And so the judges have given a very wide interpretation to the principles of in the course of and out of employment to ensure that workers are not denied their due. Whatever meager amounts. Of course, the compensation amount is a very meager amount. It's not even what you would otherwise get if you had an insurance. But it is still better. And of course, the history of this legislation is very important. So when we ask the question, what is the purpose of labor law, with reference to, let us say, something like Workmen's Compensation Act, you know that the purpose of the Workmen's Compensation Act was so that workers don't have to go through lengthy court procedures in order to be able to claim those small amounts of compensation. So the Workmen's Compensation Act came as, some kind of a balance between tort law and contract law. That is, you can have a contract with the employer which says that the employer has no liability. And the other extreme is you can have a tort liability where a workman can go to court and prove the negligence of the employer and ask for a huge amount of compensation, which would perhaps even shut down the employment place. So the Workmen's Compensation Act comes as an interim measure, as a kind of a balancing measure between these two extremes. That is where worker gets nothing and where worker gets so much that the employer is out of work. Compensation is provided as a very rough and ready method of giving some relief to the worker. So the Socratic method would be, you ask the question, okay, what is the purpose of the Workmen's Compensation Act, and interpret the legislation and look at the case in terms of how this purpose is being met or not being met. The other way in which one looks at labor law and in terms of methodology, you could use something like an information giving method, which is that, okay, I know the law, I am the expert, and all of you are, people to whom we need to give certain information, and you can dump a lot of information upon students. But generally, this is not as much a preferred method as a method where you are learning with the person that you are talking to, or what is known as a co-learning method. In a co-learning method, and at least I find this very useful, where you ask students to bring in some material, where you ask students to say, okay, is there a case that you know of where we can think about how the law would apply, and both of you together see how the law would apply in that given situation. In many cases, this allows students to engage with the course in a much more personal way, because they have brought in something unique. They feel that they have also been able to add to the law, they have been able to understand it better, they have been able to apply it, and that sense of ownership that it gives can be very useful. So let's look at one example of what I would understand as a critical method. Let me show you a set of pictures, and you can tell me whether or not these people are workers under labor law. Okay, so I'll show each picture for maybe like a couple of seconds. So the question is, does the law, I mean, what we know as labor law, really bring in all of these various forms of work? Now, all of these are pictures, all of these are images that we see all around us. And so if one can just look around us, it is very obvious that there is tremendous activity constantly happening all around us. And the question is, okay, if there is so much activity, in fact, human life is almost impossible without so much activity going around all around you. What kind of work does labor law actually address? Yeah. Does anybody want to say anything? You could put it in the chat box if you have anything to say. So what you can see is not all workers are covered by labor law, right? So for example, if you look at the rickshaw puller, now we know that excepting for perhaps the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act, the other laws that we usually study, whether it is industrial disputes or minimum wages, compensation, none of them apply to him, because this is a worker who is in that sense self-employed. He does not satisfy the employee-employer relationship. Possibly by looking at his beard, you could also say that he is beyond the age of what is normally considered working age. And so these are persons that the law does not, the labor law really does not address. Yeah. And if you look at people who are carrying on activities on their own, uh, or who are carrying on traditional activities, these are again people who don't fall within the definition of the law because they are seen as artisans or artists, and they are not considered to be within the definition of labor law. So notwithstanding the very wide definition that you have of industry, it is still very clear that labor law only refers to certain kinds of work and doesn't refer to most other kinds of work. And if you look at people who are engaged in very small activities, and there is this very famous quotation of Justice Krishna Iyer in the Bangalore Water Supply Board, where he says that the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, these are not people that we are contemplating as within the definition of a worker. So when you look at this variety of work that is done, and then you start looking at statute, you also come to know that labor law covers different workers for different purposes. That is, if you want to talk about minimum wages, not everybody who is a workman under Industrial Disputes Act only is covered by minimum wages. You continue to cover people through the Minimum Wages Act, although they might not be workers or it might not be an industry. For example, in the states of Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, domestic workers have been brought within the definition of workers for purposes of minimum wages, but they are not within the definition of worker for other purposes. So what the legislation is trying to do also determines who is covered. So the first question that you ask, okay, what is the purpose of this particular statute? Then the purpose of that statute is also then going to determine who is covered by that statute. Now we know that labor law consists of at least 35 central legislations and more than 150 state legislations. What we will conclude as we look at these various definitions is that there is no uniform definition of a worker. And in fact, we have different definitions in different legislations. So, for example, if you look at the Code on Social Security that is still being drafted, which is trying to bring together very different legislations like the ESI and the Workmen's Compensation Act and contract labor, you're trying to bring these various definitions under one code. You have this definition of a building worker, who is a person who is employed to do skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled, manual, technical, clerical work. And this is very similar to the kind of definition that you see in the Industrial Dispute Act, unlike the definition of employee in the ESI and the EPF Act, which is very wide. Similarly, if you look at the definition of employee under under the Code of Wages, then you're talking about whether or not the terms of employment are express or implied, and it includes a person who is declared to be an employee by the appropriate government. Again, if you look at legislations like the POSH, there you do not even have a definition of a workman, because POSH, that is a legislation that is meant to deal with sexual harassment of women at the workplace, extends protections of this legislation to any aggrieved woman. And it includes a woman of any age, whether employed or not. So a woman need not be employed at a particular workplace for the legislation to apply to her. Similarly, if you look at the definition of bonded labor, you have a very different and a very wide definition of bonded labor. And if you look at definitions which are very inclusive, then you have the Manrega, which most people do not even categorize as a labor legislation, although it is dealing with offering work to a large group. Perhaps if you look at it empirically, the Manrega possibly is a legislation that covers more workers than any other single legislation. And here we have the definition of an applicant to mean the head of a household or any of its adult members who have applied for employment under the scheme. On the other hand, you also have an identification of workers by exclusion. So if you look at the unorganized sector worker, the definition of the unorganized sector worker is based on the exclusion from any other law. So the code reads that any worker who is not covered by the ESI or the EPF or gratuity or compensation is somebody who is going to be covered by this legislation. Identifying a worker not only by the work they do, but you're identifying them by the fact that they are excluded from other legislations. And the definition of unorganized worker in the draft code on social security is a very wide definition, which possibly could bring in many of the workers that we were looking at earlier, because you could talk about a home-based worker, a self-employed worker, or a wage worker, and includes a worker who is not covered by the Industrial Disputes Act. So we are, depending on what is the purpose of the legislation, and the Social Security Code is meant to address questions of social security and afford minimum protection to a wide range of persons. Here we are working with a definition which is not the definition that would be the definition that you look at under the Industrial Dispute Act. So what is it that I have demonstrated? What we are demonstrating is that there is a huge diversity in who is covered by labor law, and this diversity can be explained by not staying within one legislation, but by looking at multiple legislation, by looking at legislations from the point of view of what is the objective and what is the purpose of this legislation. Who are workers who are included and who are workers who are excluded? Why are workers excluded for certain questions and not for the other? Though this understanding of formal, informal workers, the wage differences, that, so for example, we have supervisory and managerial work that doesn't fall within the definition of law for purposes of ID Act. But if you look at the Provident Fund Act or you look at the Gratuity Act, since you want to give gratuity to a wider section of workers, you have a different definition of worker for purposes of that legislation. We have also seen that there are constructs which one needs to deal with when one is looking at labor law. So whether it is persons with disability, whether we are talking about exclusion of law in terms of constructs of gender, we're talking about caste-based discrimination, where you have occupational segregation, you have child labor, and you have migrant labor who are largely from the marginalized classes. You have a different understanding of the purpose of labor law. So to conclude this particular section, what we have tried to say is why and how you can read labor law critically. That in this way you can source diverse materials. You can look at contemporary reality, that is, you can look at the modernizing effort made by the state to bring in law into 4 codes. Then you can also talk about locating labor within other branches of law, such as criminal law. When you talk about bonded labor, you're talking about trafficking of persons for labor. You can also seek to establish interconnections of labor law with other branches. We can also look at labor law within a constitutional framework and talk about transforming them into questions of dignity. So with this, I will stop this particular session, and then any questions on this you can ask them at this point, and I'll take questions, and then we will move to the other part of contemporary challenges. So there are quite a few questions here, so let me look at them. So there's one question which says, if labor law is past glory and historic in nature, then are there no futuristic challenges? Can you elaborate on domestic workers' rights? I will cover this when we're looking at what is the future for labor law. So when we are looking at the second part of my presentation, I think we will talk about some questions of gendered nature of labor law and how this can be changed. The other question is from Mr. Prabhakar, who says the doctrine of hire and fire in industrial employment means sacking employees without compensation. is inhuman, ultra-vires, against the spirit of constitution, against fundamental rights and violation of human rights. That is true. Any policy that doesn't treat people with dignity would be violative of fundamental rights. The other question you asked, yeah, and this is a little too late. I didn't see this question, otherwise I would have had the slides in full screen. Maybe the next time I will do that. Audio is not clear. Can somebody clarify if the audio is clear or not?
It's clear, ma'am.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Because somebody mentioned here the audio is not clear. Okay, another question is, why do we call it labor law? Is it not a stigma on those professionals who are related with it? That's true. This whole question of why do we use labor is that you're very right. I mean, we have used labor in the Indian context. The problem with labor has been its association with the marginalized classes. Has been its association with the working classes who have traditionally not been seen as entitled to rights and dignity. And so there is this added stigma to the word labor, but those persons who want to bring the law's attention to the condition of those people, that is, talk about labor in terms of the exploitation of this class, want to continue to use the term labor because theoretically labor represents a group, labor represents a class, and unless we are saying that these class battles are over and these class questions are not relevant, and what we are seeing, for example, if you look at the entire migrant work crisis that we had just a month, it brings to stark notice that while most blue-collared employees could stay at home, even if they were unhappy, they had a roof above their head and they could sit at home. You had all these workers who didn't have a place and had to walk home, right? So these are questions which are really more which continue to be very relevant, and so there's a deliberate need to use the term labor in a forceful and in a manner that directs attention to some questions of exploitation which are still unaddressed under the constitutional scheme. So I would not want to argue that we should change labor law, but we need to understand that what labor represents. Labor represents a question of people who work, and unless we are able to give dignity to work, labor will continue to be stigmatized. Sridevi is saying the concept of gig workers is not addressed at all by current labor law. That is true, and hence the new codes on social security are trying to address the question of gig workers. The other question that Mr. Kameshwar Rao has is how social security aspects of migrant labor during COVID-19. It's true that especially during the COVID, we saw that migrant workers seemed to have been left high and dry. There were many efforts made by state and some employers who tried to assure the workers that their employments will be secured, they will continue to be employed. But somehow workers were not finding that enough and they decided to walk home. So is this somewhere where Social Security has failed? I think today the problem has been that the Social Security legislations only cover the formal sector. They don't really address the problems of the informal sector, and that is the reason why these legislations could not provide the sufficient amount of protection that they were intended to provide. And the state had to step in with things like wages for Manrega, or it had to step in with food distribution. It had to step in with the PDS, and it had to provide for various other measures of Social Security, because the Social Security legislations that we have are only directed and cover only certain questions, certain kinds of workers. What changes would there be after Labor Code? Okay, we'll discuss them. Yes, Aman Mani Tripathi points out that the majority of workers are not protected by labor law. It's true. Sirisha has asked a question where survival is equivalent to growth by relaxing labor laws. Can economic activity be revived or in long term leads to anti-labor. I wouldn't say long term leads to anti-labor. In the short term also it's very anti-labor. And the logic seems to be that somehow regulating economic activity means that you are hindering economic activity, whereas there is enough evidence to show that economic activity is not hindered by regulation, but economic activity requires regulation, and regulation can actually improve economic activity. Neha has a question. Neha Agarwal has a question. Since a migrant laborer enjoys social security at his place of birth, such as PDS, Manrega, but economic security in urban cities, we have seen their mass exodus. Why is there a reluctance to recognize and protect socio-economic rights of workers at their place of work? It's a very, very good question, Neha. It's very well put. Migrant labor, particularly, although we have a legislation, we have a very big legislation to deal with migrant labor. It's considered one of the best legislations that we have. It still does not cover all migrant laborers. So a lot of migrant labor is out of the purview of this legislation, and that's the reason why there is no protection. I don't know if one wants to talk about it as a reluctance to recognize their rights, as much as not being able to devise appropriate mechanisms. And if labor law is seen as a hindrance, if regulation is seen as holding back economic activity, that is the reason why you're finding that they are not protected their place of work. But as you have very rightly pointed out, that the state cannot escape from its liability, and the whole PDS in Manrega is something that is coming in as one way of extending protection. But the protection is not happening through labor law. And a lot of people are arguing for income as well, which is another way of extending protection, but that's not happening through labor legislation. In fact, if you look at the COVID announcement, along with the COVID announcement, the government had announced that the employer will not remove people from employment, and that the employer will pay wages. But so the problem was not that there was a reluctance to admit their liability, as much as not having the wherewithal to enforce that will. Rajalakshmi has a very good question. Who could be liable for gas leak at Visakhapatnam? That is true. That case really brought back memories of the Bhopal gas tragedy, where you saw major amendments to the Factories Act. So when there is an argument that regulation hinders economic activity, and come up with these kinds of incidents where you see a mass, everybody is impacted by an accident at a workplace. It's not only question of protecting workers' rights when you talk about regulation, right? You are trying to protect society, the larger society, which is impacted by accidents at the workplace. So you're very right. I mean, how can you talk about these safety issues not being of any significance, and how can we talk about repealing legislation and regulation merely to enhance economic activity? That is very, very short-sighted, in fact, and it leads to greater dangers than trying to take a much more balanced approach towards these questions. Rajalakshmi also asked whether social security is there for migrant laborers. Like Neha pointed out, the social security is there in terms of PDS or Manrega or the distribution of money that the state governments did. Through labor legislations, unfortunately, not all workers, but of course, those workers who are in regular employment, if we're talking about protecting their salary, protecting their provident fund, who continue to be protected by the law, surely there is some protection for them. Ramalu asks the question, is the Bangalore water supply the final word? To my mind, it has not been overruled, although there have been many cases where the Supreme Court has said that this decision needs to be overruled. It continues to be the dominant understanding of the definition of industry. And we'll have to, if you look at the Industrial Relations Code, which is trying to replace IDTU and standing orders, they have kind of gone with the newer definition of industry. But till such time that that legislation is notified, the Industrial Dispute Act continues to have the definition as given in the Bangalore Water Supply Board. The other question is, does the interpretation, Muthukumar asks the question, does the interpretation of definition of industry still hold good in the era of LPG? My view of referring the Bangalore Water Supply Board to a larger bench to reconsider definition of industry. The reason, I mean, I would say that the Bangalore Water Supply Board, even with its wide definition of industry, does not cover most industry in India, right? If you look at the pictures that I shared, whether it is agricultural workers, whether it is self-employed workers, whether it's workers in the informal sector, even this wide definition of industry doesn't cover all of them. So what the court was trying to do in that case was to not confine it to just the manufacturing sector, and said that no, it's not just manufacturing sector, but a whole range of other workplaces need to be brought within the fold of labor law. And I think that is a very valid and a very important contribution that the court has made. But post Bangalore Water Supply, we have seen changes. For example, you have separate laws made for educational institutions, which perhaps better covers their needs than the Industrial Disputes Act, because Industrial Dispute Act still doesn't apply to all educational institutions and doesn't cover teachers, for example. So Bangalore Water Supply has its own pros and cons, but in terms of whether the court should take a different view, I think the court must only expand the scope of labor law and not try to read it down. And so to that extent, I think I would agree with retaining the Bangalore Water Supply decision, because it has a very purposive interpretation to Industrial Disputes Act. It's not a very narrow interpretation. So I personally will prefer that definition. Sudhakar has a question. In order to establish employer and worker relation, the relation might be contract of service, but not contract for service. In contract of service, the worker will discharge as per direction, supervision. It is something like liberal profession. I don't think there's a question there as much as a clarification about what is the difference between contract of service and contract for services. Nandini has a question on cross-border labor issues. I'm not sure how she means cross-border. Are you talking about international migration? And international migration in that sense, and that's usually how we understand cross-border. International migration carries with it its own complexities. And there is a big question about whether it addresses, whether any labor law can address the question of cross-border migration. Labor law is quite blind to the question of where the worker is coming from. It doesn't matter. If you have entered into a contract of employment, if you are rendering employment, then you are bound by labor law. You can't say that because you're a migrant worker, I don't have to pay you. In fact, there is a strong, there's a growing scholarship which says that even questions of trafficking. So for example, if you have a worker who has moved from India to Dubai and has worked for a period of time and then later on is removed from the employer, maybe his migration process wasn't correct. Should he be entitled to wages for that period, or should he come back empty-handed, right? And so a lot of people have been arguing for a labor law approach to the question of trafficking as well, and saying that, you know, the solution should be safe migration rather than a prohibition on migration for employment. And so I would say that yes, labor law does have a role to play in talking about international migration as well. Ravichandra Yadav has a question on, please throw some light on, does the government has to create more jobs in the era of liberalization, privatization, globalization? I will come to that in just a minute. So in the second part of my presentation, I hope I will cover that. Does sexual harassment at workplace cover mental harassment, setting daily unrealistic targets, taking stringent action on consumer complaints? Yes, this is a very, very important question. But I think what India lacks is a general understanding of harassment in the workplace, not necessarily sexual harassment. There are other countries, for example, France and other European countries have a law with reference to harassment in the workplace, which is gender neutral and it's not about sexual harassment alone. But unfortunately, India has not gone in that way. It is only covering one form of harassment. It's only covering sexual harassment. Janvi has a question. I think that's the last question. Yes, Janvi has a question. What about child migrants who are working in small scale industries like brick making, child migrants who are doing domestic help? Is there any security for them, especially those children who are facing sexual harassment in domestic as well as small industry? Now, as far as sexual harassment is concerned, we are. I think the POCSO deals with the whole question of sexual offences, and so it is not being seen as a labor law question. It is being seen as a criminal law question, and so that would really fall within the realm of a criminal legislation. But about child labor, yes, children who are working in industries, in even as domestic help, at least the Child Labor Act says that all hazardous industries should not employ children. And domestic work is also seen as hazardous industry, so children should not be employed as domestic help. So it's clearly illegal there, and so there is no question of this being acceptable at all. Thank you all so much for these questions, and I think what I will try and do is look at the second part of my presentation, where I'm looking at contemporary challenges to labor law. Okay, can somebody tell me if this is visible to you?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Thank you so much. So I will, I think I have half an hour, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Half an hour more, ma'am.
Okay, so I will try and wrap up this presentation in half an hour. Since we've taken the questions earlier, I will try to see how we can understand this particular part. So what are the contemporary challenges to labor law as we're looking at it today? And here, like all of you have already pre-guessed, what has been the impact of globalization, privatization, and liberalization on labor law, particularly post-2000? What is the scenario, and how are these new developments to be understood in the light of the older historical understanding of labor law? So the changes that liberalization, privatization, and globalization have brought about is a shift from a welfare state. Now, and this is very clear, right? And this is not something, and I will demonstrate each of these points. I am merely giving you an overview of what we are going to do in this particular session. One is a shift from a welfare state. The second is a shift from regulation, wherein you had what is known as an inspector Raj, to self-regulation and deregulation. What is the changing nature of work? As has been pointed out by some of you also, you have informal labor, you have child labor, the typical understanding of a worker in industry, the changing definition of industry as well. All of these are something that we need to take into account. The increase in contract labor, all of these, in these new changes, how do we understand labor law? Some of you have raised very important questions of international migration. So when markets are integrated, why is labor not integrated? Why isn't there a free movement of people across borders when there is a free movement of capital across borders? What is the increase in contingent work, that is contract work? As teachers also, all of you are very familiar, the phenomenal growth of contract teaching has been a result that you have seen particularly in the past 20 years. And the last 20 years also show us, it's more than 20 actually, now it's almost 25. If you look in the 90s as the period of liberalization is almost 25 years, has been the increased participation of women in paid work. Women always worked. In fact, there is a saying that women always work and all women work. But we're talking about participation of women in paid employment. So let's see how we discuss all these different changes. So the shift from welfare state. The Second National Commission on Labour, which was set up in 1999, and its terms of reference were to suggest rationalization of existing laws relating to labor in the organized sector, and second, to suggest an umbrella legislation for ensuring a minimum level of protection to workers in the unorganized sector. Now, this can be contrasted with what the first National Commission of Labour was trying to look at. The resolution of the Government of India asked the Commission to take into account various factors which made the Commission necessary, and these were identified as the globalization of the economy, the liberalization of trade and industry, and its likely effect on labor. The Commission noted that there was an urgent need to review existing laws in the unorganized sector. It said that there were inadequacies of laws and structures in the unorganized sector. And the Commission itself noticed that its terms of reference were very different from the terms of reference for the first National Commission on Labour. Let us look at what the first National Commission on Labour was set up to do. Its terms of reference were to review changes in conditions of labor. So we are not talking about rationalization of labor law. We are talking about, okay, the Indian Constitution promised its workers that it will address the question of exploitation. And if you look at the second term of reference, to review legislations intended to protect labor and to advise how far these provisions serve to implement the directive principles of state policy on labor matters and the national objectives of establishing a socialist society and achieving planned economic development. I think this by itself is enough evidence that there is a huge impact of liberalization on the question of labor. The Second National Commission then discussed the impact of globalization and suggested reforms in existing law, and also said that you need a law on unorganized sector workers. Its recommendations included a recommendation that said that you need an attitudinal change and change in the mindset and work culture where employer and worker work as partners with an emphasis on participative management. This is something that my friend must take note of. If we want to move away from the stigmatizing idea of labor, then we need to move to a situation where the employer and the employee are seen as partners. And as long as we are working in a very hierarchical atmosphere, this idea of partnership is not going to take root. One of the important shifts in the Second National Commission of Labour brought about was in making the Contract Labour Act inapplicable to various activities. And Andhra Pradesh was a leader in this area, where it said that a whole range of activities may now be done with the help of contract labor. And the entire older idea of the abolition of contract labor was virtually put to a silent death. So what you are seeing post-liberalization is that while you still have the Contract Labor Act, it's not like we have done away with the Contract Labor Act. And the Contract Labor Act says, let us abolish contract labor. But in spite of that, it is a provision that is not used. And the state deliberately does not use certain provisions of the law. And this is the new approach towards labor that we are seeing. Of course, what you saw in UP is that you just repeal all of these laws. But what you're seeing in other states is what we can call a silent repeal, that the legislation is there, but it is not going to be enforced. The National Common Minimum of 2006 states that labor laws, other than the ID Act, that create an Inspector Raj will be re-examined and procedures harmonized and streamlined. And this brings us to the second point, that what you are seeing post these reforms is a system of self-regulation, that the state is no longer going to regulate by conducting inspections. A system of third-party inspections should be established to give enterprises an option to get their regulatory compliances certified by external agencies. And so here you have like the ISSO, and you have other organizations which are going to certify that an employer is meeting with all the requirements of law, but the state itself is not going to do this certification. And this you see in various places. In fact, the entire COVID saw that labor law was being repealed so that you increase the ease of doing business. And the ease of doing business is by talking about a compliance regime based on self-certification. It exempts new startups from any inspection. You have the use of internet and the technology to simplify online compliance. Now here you had the PMO, which directed Ministry of Labor and Employment to ensure that all states establish a system of self-certification for 5 years for the following laws. And you can see that the Migrant Workers Act is also one of those laws for which you have self-certification. Contract labor, self-certification, gratuity, ESI, EPF, all the major legislations which require compliance reports and which require annual reports are being moved to a system of self-certification. And with globalization, the promise was that globalization would lead to an expansion in employment opportunities. There would be better quality of jobs, there would be faster economic growth, and supply chain and better technological linkages were said to improve observance of minimum labor standards. But has this promise really been realized? What we have seen is there is a decline in employment. So what you will read in popular press as jobless growth. You see an increase of casual workers. You see the share of unorganized sector workers, which is characterized by irregular, insecure, low productive, and no social protection at all. This kind of employment has increased rather than the promise that globalization will actually bring us better jobs. Similarly, a joint report by the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations and the Indian Committee of the Netherlands concludes that several core labor rights are being violated in the global knitwear sector in Tamil Nadu. These mills are part of the supply chain. So while you are seeing that you have establishments which are cross-border, the workers do not benefit from this, and they are in that sense neither workers of employers within India, nor are they receiving benefits of being employees of an industry outside India. So if you look at European and US markets and the kind of wages those workers would get, Indian workers don't even get a fraction of those wages, and not even a fraction of the protection that those workers are entitled to. What is even more important, and this relates to our whole self-regulation and self-certification question, the report highlights the lack of transparency and openness. So you had a question, right? That if you have a Korean company where there is a gas leak, who are we going to hold liable for this? The employer might not even be sitting in this country anymore, and you will have a local employer who is not the person who takes decisions. So this question of the international economic integration without strong laws that would enforce accountability leads to a greater lack of implementation for labor law. The other dimension is the explosion of contract labor. And the race for competitiveness, including in terms of wages, had led to the drastic increase in employment of contract labor, including in public sector. And this is the hallmark of globalization. You're no longer saying it's private sector that's the biggest employer of contract labor. In today's world, it is the public sector that's the biggest employer of contract labor. And very openly, the state is saying that this is in order to cut costs. This is in order to increase profits. Whereas if you go back to what is the objective of state, the state is not intended to be making profits. The state was supposed to be a model employer, and all of that has been given a go-by with increasing contractualization. The contrast between the Air India decision, which came in the early 90s, which took a rights-based approach, a public law interpretation, which said with the abolition of contract labor, contract workers will become employees of the principal employer. The SAIL decision said that no, the statute does not provide for it, and hence we cannot read in a remedy which the statute explicitly doesn't provide for. Now, with the SAIL decision that comes in 2000, and the Second National Commission also saying that no, when a judicial opinion has said that you can't have regularization, how can we direct regularization? So you actually had the Second National Commission saying it is bound by the SAIL decision. And an interesting piece of history here, the first National Commission's report said that contract labor should be avoided as much as possible, and the person who chaired the first National Commission, Justice Gajendra Gadkar, had given an opinion in the Standard Vacuum Refining Company Limited, which said that where it is not necessary, the contract labor system should not be used and workers should be employed directly so that they get the benefits. And this is the sharp contrast that you see between the first and the second National Commission on Labor. This contractualization from industry has also crept into public employment, and in the Uma Devi case, the Supreme Court again said that sure, the government can go ahead and take people even for core government activities. You can use contract labor, and a sovereign government, considering the economic situation in the country and the work that needs to be done, is not precluded from making temporary appointments or engaging workers on daily wages. And this was a petition in the Supreme Court which said that while there were positions and while there was work that was being done, or important government work that was being done, which was being done by temporary workers, and the Supreme Court was asked to step in, the Supreme Court said that no, there is no right to be regularized. The court here was dealing with irregular appointments being made by the state without even an advertisement, without even trying to take in people for the positions that were available. The court held that in spite of working for the state under such irregular employment, the worker would not be entitled to any right to be absorbed into the service of the state. The Food Corporation of India, which till 2014 was prohibited from hiring contract labor, has sought an exemption from the prohibition and allowing of employment of contract labor to save 600 crores. The other dimension that we have seen with contractualization, with falling standards at work, is the sharp increase of women in paid employment. But unfortunately, this sharp increase of women has been in temporary, casual, home-based employment. And the rate at which this form of employment is growing outstrips the rate of growth in full-time, long-term employment. And these are the fundamental changes in the nature of work which need to be taken into account when one talks about the new forms of work, when talks about what the new codes should be addressing and how labor law needs to be re-envisioned. Feminization also brings to fore the gendered nature of work. And this is one issue that when you looked at labor as a homogeneous class, you didn't look at this in terms of what is the kind of work that is being covered by the law and the kind of work that is not covered by the law, and how does the division between paid and unpaid work operate with reference to what kind of opportunities a woman have and what is seen as work and what is not seen as work. Since unpaid work is not accounted for, and since regulating work in a manner that accounts for unpaid work it is not there, you continue to see women in low-skilled, casual, low-wage work, which allows them to carry on their unpaid work along with trying to make some kind of money out of paid employment as well. But they will only engage in peripheral work because their other burdens of care work also need to be taken care of. The link of feminization and globalization is something that we should account for. Because if you look at migration for domestic work, then India is emerging as the largest source country for immigration. Women constitute a major part of this immigration, although the numbers are often not accurate because a lot of women, out of lack of knowledge, out of lack of any exposure, out of illiteracy, might hide why they are migrating. A lot of women say that they are migrating for taking care of family or migrating for tourism and end up working, and this becomes a form of illegal migration. And the fastest growing sector for female employment has been domestic work. If you have been reading the newspapers, you have seen that there are many reported cases of widespread human rights and labor right abuse. And the global care chain is linking the rise in female employment in Europe and the Western countries to the rising female employment for domestic work by migrant women in Asia. And this is not just India. This is Nepal, this is Philippines, this is Bangladesh, this is other Southeast Asian countries, wherein you are seeing even skilled workers. That is, you're seeing nurses who are migrating to Canada and the United States to work as domestic help. The absence of any framework which addresses the rights of these workers has moved India to enter into bilateral agreements with these countries to extend some protections. The global care chain was first used to refer to a series of personal links between people across the globe. And she uses a very dramatic example: an older daughter from a poor family who cares for her siblings, while her mother works as a nanny caring for the children of a migrating nanny, who in turn cares for the child of a family in a rich country. So you can see the chain is being formed here, that is created here, which is the chain between unpaid work. That is, an older daughter looking after her siblings is the unpaid work, which is linked to the paid work that her mother would make, which is in turn linked to the other paid work that other people are doing. And this is creating a global care chain across the world. And this is the link of feminization with globalization. The important amendments have been brought about the Industrial Disputes Act. There are important decisions of the Supreme Court on a shift in understanding entitlements. There are important notifications by state and central government with reference to labor law. But what we also need to examine here are what are the new social movements which have been emerging. So this is not entirely a situation wherein there is only a downward move. You are seeing efforts at mobilization. For example, the street vendors movement is a very good example of mobilizing street vendors to articulate for a framework. And very interestingly, they argued their right under Article 19 by claiming that they have a right to carry on an occupation, and street vending must be seen as an occupation, must not be seen as an illegal activity, which it was seen in the past. So by organizing, these workers have been able to visualize their work and force the state to deal with these forms of work. Similarly, domestic workers movements have led to changes wherein you have the inclusion of domestic workers in minimum wages, in POSH, in social security legislations. So there is a mobilization, but these mobilizations are sector specific. There is no pan-labor movement that we are seeing now. You are seeing various sectors which are articulating their needs, their demands, and their framework distinctly. Similarly, you have rag pickers movements. You have movements which are organizing women as a category and talking about various issues, including questions of employment. So these are important shifts that one needs to acknowledge. It is also important to acknowledge the new solidarities which are emerging. Today, the articulation of labor rights as human rights. For example, if you look at domestic workers, you look at migrant labor, the argument has been not only from the point of view of labor, but also seeing labor rights as human rights. If you remember the bar dancers judgment, which came in a couple of years back, in a follow-up judgment last year, you saw that even this form of work was considered to be the right to dignity and expression, and these women were considered as workers who were entitled to be recognized as carrying on an occupation, and it was seen as an expression, since they were dancing, and dance was seen as a form of expression. You have also seen sewage workers. You had the Delhi Jail Board, wherein the Delhi High Court directed the state that it cannot outsource its obligations of providing for compensation. And you're also seeing persons with disabilities organizing around questions of employment, women's movements engaging with opening employment avenues. So to conclude, I think we have looked at the impact of liberalization, globalization, privatization on conditions in terms of employment. We have looked at a variety of material, theoretical, empirical, statute, as well as case law, to be able to understand what the impact of this has been on questions of labor and employment. So I think I have finished well in time.
On behalf of the Department of Law, Usmania University, I would like to propose vote of thanks to you, ma'am. It's my privilege and honor to propose vote of thanks to you. Thank you, ma'am, for agreeing to be the resource person. And also, thank you so much for your lucid presentation, ma'am. This was the first time the presentation was made in two parts, where the questions were taken after the first part, and the second session continued, ma'am. Like, it was quite a learning experience, ma'am. Like, even this was a new type of teaching methodology which you have given practically in your way of presentation, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Irfan, and thank you all for your wonderful questions. There are still many questions which I have not answered. So thank you so much for being such an engaging audience. And thank you, Irfan. Thank you, Vinod Kumar Garu, for giving me this opportunity to be part of this online program.